Welcome back. Today we're talking about correlation. So we have already talked about the experimental model. We talked about experimental methods being the only way that we can find a causal relationship between two variables. So today we're talking about correlation. When we do a correlational study, we may find that a relationship exists between two variables, but we don't know necessarily in which direction that relationship goes. For example, does social media use cause depression, low self-esteem, anxiety? There are lots of misleading headlines out there saying that it does, but the reality is we really don't know. We don't know if social media use causes people feel depressed, or if people who are already depressed just tend to go on social media more, kind of seeking out more connection. There really has not been a conclusive study done to date that can tell us definitively how exactly that relationship works. So let's start here just by looking at a couple of examples. Mental illness correlates with smoking. That means that people who experience mental illness are also more likely to be smokers. But does that tell us anything about what causes mental illness or smoking? Absolutely not. Because there might be something about smoking that leads to mental illness, or those with mental illness just might be more likely to smoke. We're going to talk in a second about something called a third variable problem. We might have a third variable that influences both of our other variables. Perhaps someone who has a stressful home life contributes both to smoking and to the onset of mental illness. So you see how it's really difficult when we only have causal data to try to infer it's difficult when we have only correlational data to assume anything about a causal relationship between two variables. And we've got some other examples down here that you can look at. How would you interpret these recent findings? First, that sexual hookups correlate with college women's experiencing depression. So in other words, the more hookups, the more depressed. Also, delaying sexual intimacy correlates with positive outcomes like greater relationship and satisfaction and stability. So in other words, the longer people wait to have sex, the more satisfied they tend to be and the more stable their relationship tends to be. But there's lots of different explanations for this too. Sexual restraint may lead to better mental health and stronger relationships. Depression could lead people to be more likely to hook up. But then we've got this third factor, which is people who have lower impulsivity, or in other words, they're better able to delay gratification, which is going to show itself as being able to exhibit sexual restraint. But that ability to delay gratification and be less impulsive is also related more generally to psychological well-being and being able to maintain better relationships. So again, we can't look at this data and just assume one leads to the other, because we've got lots of possible explanations, including even a third variable. So one more example, consider self-esteem correlates negatively with and therefore can predict depression. So in other words, and that's what we're talking about with correlation. We're talking about one variable can predict another, not necessarily cause another. Someone with low self-esteem is likely to also experience depression. However, we don't know if it's the low self-esteem that causes the depression, or the depression that causes the low self-esteem, or if there's some kind of a third factor involved, such as someone who's already biologically predisposed to depression, or someone experiencing really stressful, distressing life events, which could contribute both to low self-esteem and depression. We're going to do this You Try It together as a class. The main point to remember in all of this is if you do correlational research, if you do not do a full-blown experiment, you cannot infer causation. Correlation does not equal causation. Correlation can suggest a possible cause-effect relationship, but that means you would then have to go on and do a full-blown experiment. You'd have to randomly sample randomly assign to your control and your experimental groups, manipulate a variable, the independent variable, and show that your results aren't due to chance alone, which is something we talk about later in the unit, if you want to really show a cause and effect relationship.